Hejka, cześć. Może chcecie posłuchać, co tam w neurochirurgii słychać. Dr Michael opowiada o operacjach, jakie przeprowadzał na żywych mózgach. W komentarzu wkleiłem to streszczenie, już nie będę tutaj tego czytał. Jak chcecie, to się z tym sami zapoznajcie. Ogólnie bardzo ciekawe rzeczy, co ten pan mówi. Warto mieć to na uwadze. Zaraz puszczę wam fragment tej rozmowy, a link do całości jest oczywiście w komentarzu. No to narka, ściskam i do następnego, pa.
Scientific evidence for the soul overwhelming. Our guest today is a former materialist who rejected belief in the soul, but because of his work and research as a surgeon, he now believes the scientific evidence is compelling. Why did he change his mind, and what is that evidence? Well, you're about to find out. We welcome for the first time Dr. Michael Egner, author of the new book that I endorsed and found fascinating. It's called The Immortal Mind. Dr. Egner, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, the book starts with this fascinating, jarring story that when I read it, I went to my wife and I was like, you've got to hear this story. It's somewhat of a conversion story before you get into the scientific evidence for the soul. Since you start the book there, let's start this interview with your powerful conversion story.
Sure. I was born into a kind of a non-religious family as a child, and I fell in love with science at a very early age. And I thought that all the mysteries of life, all the really meaningful things that one could discover could be discovered with science. So I believed in the Darwinian way of understanding man, and in, physics and chemistry and all those things. And I majored in biochemistry in college, and I wanted to be a doctor, and I really wanted to be a neurosurgeon because I wanted to understand the brain and the mind, because I thought that I would understand on a deep level who we are and what we are if I knew all the science there was to know about the brain. So I graduated from medical school. I trained in neurosurgery and graduated from my residency in 1991 and went out and practiced as a neurosurgeon. And a number of things happened to me as a neurosurgeon and as a husband and a father that changed the way I look at the world. As a neurosurgeon, I began finding patients who had large parts of their brains missing. A good example was a little girl who was born with only about half her brain. And I counseled her family that this didn't look good. I couldn't be sure how she would do, but it didn't look encouraging. And as she grew up, I followed her, and she was normal at every stage of development. In fact, rather bright. Wow. She's now in her mid-20s and a vibrant, normal young woman, has a great job. Her mother says she's too smart for her own good, and she has half a brain. I have a number of other patients with major parts of their brains missing who are really okay, who are really fine. And that didn't fit any of the neuroanatomy textbooks that I read in medical school. There were strange things going on there. The whole thing kind of came to a head when I was operating many years ago on a woman who had a brain tumor in her left frontal lobe. And we do awake brain surgery at times. And what awake brain surgery means is that the patient is given a local anesthetic like Novocaine, so they don't feel pain. The brain itself has no sensation of pain, so it's just like cutting your hair. You don't feel anything. And we can stimulate the surface of the brain and get a map of the critical parts of the brain. So, for example, if I'm removing a tumor, I can find out what parts I have to protect and what parts I can safely remove to get the tumor out. So it makes the operation safer. So she was awake, and I was taking out the tumor and taking out much of the left frontal lobe of her brain, and we were having a conversation. And it was a perfectly normal conversation. It's the same kind of conversation you and I are having here right now, as her big part of her brain is coming out. And it didn't seem to make any difference in her conversation. Fortunately, that was the whole point of the surgery, was to keep her healthy. And after that operation, I thought, my goodness gracious, we don't understand what the brain does. There's something deeper here, because none of my textbooks said you could take out most of the left frontal lobe and have a person be perfectly normal. So I began looking more deeply into the neuroscience of the brain and the soul to try to explain why I had seen these strange things with people with parts of their brains missing who were perfectly normal, that I can take out part of a woman's frontal lobe as I'm talking to her and it doesn't change her. And I found that there were other neurosurgeons and other scientists who really had seen the same kind of thing, that I wasn't the first person to notice this. The greatest scientist in the neurosurgical profession was a guy named Wilder Penfield, who worked back in the mid-20th century in Montreal, and he pioneered the surgery of epilepsy. And one of his most common operations was awake brain surgery, the sort of thing that I had done with the woman with the tumor. And he did about 1,100 patients with awake brain surgery. So no one's ever come anywhere near that. Those kind of numbers. Awake brain surgery is still done today, but if you do a few hundred in your life, it's a large volume. So Penfield really was responsible for a lot of the mapping of the brain that we know about today. Because he operated on all these over 1,000 people and mapped all kinds of areas of their brain. And he would map them by stimulating with a little electrical probe the surface of the brain while they were awake. And he would ask them what they felt or what they saw or see if they moved. And he found peculiar things, and that really surprised him, because he had started out as a materialist just like I had. He found that when he would stimulate the brain, and he must have stimulated the brain at least 1 million times in these 1,100 patients. Well, if you count out, say, 2 stimulations a minute, and the operations last about 8 hours, I actually did the math. Yeah, it's over 1 million stimulations. Okay. He could only stimulate 4 things from the brain. He could make the person move. He could stimulate the motor area and they'd raise their arm. He could make them have a perception, let's see a flash of light, or smell something, or hear something. He could make them have an emotion. There are parts of the brain where if you stimulate it, you can get a powerful emotion. You can get fear or joy. There's a part of the brain that makes you laugh, that if you stimulate that, you feel like everything's funny. And he could stimulate memories. He could stimulate certain parts of the temporal lobe, and you'd have a memory of your mother's face or a memory of a conversation that you'd had years before. But those were the only things he could stimulate. And what he left out is everything we're doing right now. He couldn't stimulate abstract thought. He couldn't stimulate the ability to contemplate philosophy or to think about the meaning of life. He couldn't stimulate mathematics. Nowhere in the brain could he stimulate someone to say, 1 + 1 is 2. He couldn't stimulate logic or history or music, all the different kind of abstract higher level things we do. And he came to the conclusion, because he was a pretty honest man, he said, well, maybe I can't stimulate abstract thought because it doesn't come from the brain. Maybe the brain is necessary ordinarily for the exercise of abstract thought. If you drink too much alcohol or if you get hit on the head, you may not think as clearly for a while. But that doesn't mean that the thought comes from the brain. So he said that and he called abstract thought mind action. He said that you can't stimulate mind action from the brain. You can stimulate individual things: movement, perception, emotion, and memory. But that's it. And then he looked back at the whole record of seizures. Epilepsy. Look back at thousands of cases of epilepsy, and he found exactly the same thing. When people have epileptic seizures, they do certain things. They can go unconscious, but not always. Sometimes they're awake when they have the seizure, and they have movements or they have perceptions. Sometimes you have memories. Sometimes you have emotions, but there are no calculus seizures. No one's ever had a seizure where they couldn't stop doing mathematics. And Penfield said, why not? If mathematics comes from the brain, and there have been hundreds of millions of seizures, once in a blue moon, you'd trigger off 1 + 1 = 2, and you couldn't stop. He said it never happens. So the same thing that he found with seizures is what he had found with the awake brain surgery, that the brain is an organ that only does certain things. And the main things it does is it makes us move, it makes us perceive, makes us remember, and gives us emotions. But it doesn't serve as the source for abstract thought. So that was a remarkable finding, and it's been pretty much ignored within the neuroscience community. You read textbooks and people talk about it. I've had debates with neuroscientists where they say, "Oh, that Penfield study." I mean, that was 100 years ago. We have much better studies now, and the reality is we don't have much better studies now. These were on 1,100 people, over 1 million stimulations by a first-rate scientist who studied the results. And nothing we do nowadays comes anywhere near that kind of detail and that kind of rigor. So Penfield's work, I think, is amazing. He wrote a book called Mystery of the Mind. If viewers are interested in that, it's available on Amazon, where he recounts all of his experiences. He also found that free will doesn't come from the brain. And the way he found that was he would ask the person during the operation, just raise your arm occasionally, just by free will. And what I'll do is I'll stimulate occasionally the part of your brain that controls your arm, and I'll make it raise. And I want you to tell me when your arm goes up, did you do it or did I do it? And they always knew. There were tens of thousands of stimulations. He could never simulate free will. He said, well, it's because free will doesn't come from the brain. It's a spiritual power. It's not a physical power. So that got me to thinking, and it made sense in light of what I was seeing in my own patients. And so I looked deeper into the neuroscience. And I'm happy to talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah, let's go into some of these details. It's amazing that it's kind of this coalescing together of this personal spiritual journey and the neuroscience. It's not one or the other. There's kind of this intersection of the two. Let me take a step back. You said